Beware, the Ulama has come for your soul.
So it's Mr. Dry with his co-caster, the Ulama. Not to be confused with the Fellowship of Islamic Scholars, the Ulama. So we talked about pre-Columbian classical civilization, especially the Mayans and some of their predecessors. Now we're going to move on to basically central Mexico. So first contestant is the Toltecs. Really, it's not the Toltecs, it's really the Olmecs and then the Toltecs, but the Olmecs made the unfortunate decision to exist before the course actually began. So the progression goes something like this: Olmecs, Toltecs, and then the Aztecs. So the Aztecs kind of get all the love, which is going to be super ironic in just a second. But to be real, really the Aztecs stand on the shoulders of giants. The Olmecs and the Toltecs are significant influences on the Aztecs and basically on most civilizations in central Mexico. So the Toltecs migrated from northwestern Mexico into central Mexico, and if you know anything about that area, it be desert. Lots and lots of desert, very arid. So they were the first to unify central Mexico after the people of Teotihuacan. If you remember, we have to say people of Teotihuacan because we don't even really know who they are other than, well, the people of Teotihuacan. So the thing to remember about the Toltecs is that they were heavily militaristic and they liked them some war. As well as human sacrifices. And we're going to see that there's a nice cozy relationship between war and human sacrifice. So in 968, you have the establishment of the capital at Tula, and you have two rulers. One thing that's kind of interesting to note is that the Toltecs were super militaristic and they had two rulers. Let's think about some other civilizations that also sort of fall into that pattern. So, for example, the Romans had two rulers, at least during the early Republican era, with the two consuls. The Spartans also had two rulers, two kings to be precise. I don't know if this was part of the decision-making process, but it's interesting to note that militaristic civilizations tend to have two rulers. Why? Well, basically, if you are militaristic, you're going to war a lot. Well, it might surprise some of you to know that death is a common occupational hazard of, well, war. And so, if King 1 dies, you have, well, King number 2 as a spare. So the Toltecs were an agrarian civilization. In fact, agriculture began in central Mexico, probably under the ancestors of the Olmecs or the Olmecs themselves, and this began as early as 900 BCE. And of course, the staple crop of choice is going to be corn. So they did participate in long-distance trade, even to the American Southwest, like New Mexico, Arizona, etc. And coolest of all, they believe in a god that is a feathered serpent called Quetzalcoatl. He's sick. So Quetzalcoatl is a pretty big deal. It's interesting that the idea of a feathered serpent doesn't just emerge in the Toltec civilization. The idea gets around. In fact, the Mayans have a god that is also a feathered serpent. I'm sure that is a complete coincidence, named Kukulkan. So whether your preferred flavor of feathered serpent is Kukulkan or Quetzalcoatl, the fact is that the people of Mesoamerica like them some feathered snake gods. So the Toltecs have this priest king by the name of Topoltzin. My pronunciation of basically all these terms is going to be highly suspect. I am sorry. Topoltzin was, again, an aficionado and priest of Quetzalcoatl, and apparently there is a power struggle in which he is forced into exile. But Topoltzin's not one of those guys that's going to give a nice concession speech and go into the sunset. No, he basically promises that he's going to return, and with an insinuation that there's going to be some payback. And eventually, another civilization that we will eventually talk about, the Aztecs, sort of looks forward to this date where Topoltzin will return from exile. Be careful what you wish for. The Toltec Empire collapses around 1150, and like most collapses, is probably caused by a variety of factors. Uh, just like China, the Toltecs have problems with groups of raiders in their northern border attacking them constantly. Also, just like China, they have their own internal problems with instability. One of the advantages of the two-ruler system is built-in redundancy. If leader A gets killed, leader B can basically come and take their place. At the same time, it's basically like a marriage, and it has all the advantages and all the problems of a marriage. And sometimes when mommy and daddy fight, the results are not great. So the fact that Templeton was exiled probably indicates that the two-ruler system was starting to sort of fray at the seams. So this likely helps precipitate the decline, and that's all she wrote for the Toltecs. Ulama is very emotional about the demise of the Toltecs. It's all right, buddy. But life moves on, Hakuna Matata and all that, so the next contestant is going to be the Aztecs. The Aztecs really emerged for a very short period of time, basically the 12th to the 15th century CE, and really they only develop an empire by the end of that time frame. So they have a civilization that is concentrated around Lake Texcoco, which is in central Mexico. And basically, they emerge in a fairly difficult neighborhood. And we know that when you have civilizations that exist in a difficult neighborhood, well, it's kind of like fight or perish. So one of the reasons that I'm passionate about history isn't because of names and dates. I view history as the most complete record of human behavior that we have. Studies can show the behavior of human beings in controlled settings. We can learn about human beings from psychology. We can learn about them from numerology, from sociology. But if you want to learn how human beings actually are, how they act when the chips are down, you got to look at history. And so what the historical record tells us is that, and also what psychology tells us is if you've ever heard the expression, hurt people hurt, you can apply that to history. So if you look at the history of the Romans, the Assyrians, the Mongols, even the Prussians, whom we'll talk about in the 17th and 18th centuries, all of these civilizations begin with an acute sense of inferiority and basically invest everything into beating up their neighbors to defend themselves. But in so doing, they create a very militaristic society. So Lake Texcoco was highly populated, had a number of other competing civilizations and city-states. Some historians guess that the Aztecs first emerged almost like mercenaries that are used to sort of basically push out other rival civilizations. By 1325, the Aztecs had founded their capital city and really main city throughout their history called Tenochtitlan. It's right smack dab in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Couple of other things you should know about the Aztecs. Another term that we use for the Aztecs is the Mexica. By the way, if that sounds familiar, that's because, well, it has a direct connection with the Mexican people today. You're going to see a lot of modern day comparisons between the Aztecs and the United States of Mexico. The other thing that the Aztecs kind of share with some of their neighbors is, like the Toltecs, they speak a language called Nahuatl, and they worship everybody's favorite snake god, Quetzalcoatl. So, by the way, here is where Tenochtitlan is located in Lake Texcoco. You also notice that it's surrounded by a chain of other islands. These are actually mostly artificially created islands that the Aztecs used to grow food. It's actually kind of impressive. Take that, Netherlands. Anyway, So I have to tell you the founding myth of how Tenochtitlan is founded. So nowadays, when people are trying to find a place to live, they look and find like information on schools. They look at nearby amenities. They look at you know. Tax rates. I mean, there's a couple things they kind of look at, congestion. The question is, if you are part of a civilization that is wandering circa the 1200 CE, well, what do you look for? Do you look at the good schools or the bad schools? Do you look at if there is a homeowners association? Well, no, you don't have those things. Instead, the Aztecs are wandering around. They see a cactus, and on that cactus is perched an eagle with a snake in its talons, and the snake is about to become a snack. Hopefully that wasn't Quetzalcoatl. The Aztecs look at that and they're like, yeah, this is a good place to live. And by the way, you see references to that myth on the flag of modern day Mexico. Okay, so by the 1430s, the Aztecs pretty much develop an empire due to their control of the entire Lake Texcoco Valley. They conquer most of their nearby city-states and start demanding tribute from their rivals. Except this might seem a lot like China's empire, and it is similar in the extent that they demand tribute, but typically Chinese emperors were kind of happy with, they were fairly lax. The Aztecs had rather specific tastes. Human sacrifices. But before we get into the, human sacrifice thing, let's take a gander at how pretty Tenochtitlan actually was. Now, of course, this is from a later Spanish rendering of the city, but it should be noted that Tenochtitlan probably numbered anywhere from 100,000 people at the low end to close to 300,000 people at the high end. We don't really know. But, I mean, if you just look at this and you're not aware that the Aztecs are a pretty militaristic empire, and you're also not aware of the whole, human sacrifice thing, well, then you would probably think this wouldn't be a bad place to live. It sort of looks like Venice, but in Mexico, including having a big city that exists on lots of causeways and connects you to different islands. And here you can see the host of different buildings that they have. Look, they have a zoo. So most of the architecture that you're going to see from the Aztecs is not really going to reinvent the wheel. It basically incorporates designs that you see from the Toltecs, the Olmecs, the Aztecs, Teotihuacan, the terrace pyramids and all that. What the Aztecs were great at is not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but manufacturing that wheel at scale. In this respect, they're very much like the Romans. They're good practical engineers, they stick with what works, and they're good at building it to scale. I mean, they gotta be if they're gonna house up to 300,000 people in just one city. Okay, let's go over the fact that the Aztecs demanded tribute, which is a bit redundant. Here is a list of some of the things that they accepted as tribute. I'm not really going to test you thoroughly on this. What I want you to know is they like their tribute. And they had an organized bureaucracy to make sure that they got the tribute that was demanded, to see basically who's on the nice list or the naughty list. I'm now thinking of an Aztec Santa Claus. Ulama, what do you think about an Aztec Santa Claus? Ulama, you're such a skeptic. Okay, so Aztec religion was pretty central to their society. We saw that with the Mayans as well. There's a large priest class dedicated to the service of the gods. On the one hand, you have animistic deities that are sort of nature spirits. At the same time, you also have polytheistic deities that we associate with the emergence of agriculture. So we got, gods that are based on water, agriculture, fertility, the sun, so on and so forth. Okay, a minor footnote here. we should remind you guys once again that the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice. Excuse me. Yeah, the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice, which was a pretty significant component of their worship. So this is actually going to be the most difficult moment in the entire course because this is, I want you guys to be serious because this is the moment that I have to pronounce this word. And I don't really know how to pronounce this word, so it's going to be difficult for me. I encourage you not to laugh too much. So, why do the Aztecs want and like their sacrifices? Well, it's because Huitzilopochtli was a thirsty boy. So, according to legend, Huitzilopochtli, who is he's got a lot on his plate. He is the god of war, sun, and also conveniently the god of human sacrifice. He's just got a full schedule. He's got a lot to do. And, oh, by the way, he also assisted in the creation of humanity. And apparently in the process invested a lot of his blood in the process. That's a little redundant. So he's kind of worn out, and just like when you get parents that are getting on up there in years and how you kind of have to help them out, look for retirement homes for them, help take care of them, that kind of thing. If you're Huitzilopochtli, maybe you can expect your kids to chip in by, offering blood sacrifices. It's basically the same thing, right? So ask yourself, therefore, if the Aztec gods are a bunch of vampire gods, which, if true, that's pretty sick. And sick as in kind of wicked cool. I'm dating myself by even putting those words together, but whatever. So Huitzilopochtli, not only was god of war, sun, human sacrifice, he was also the patron god of Tenochtitlan. Again, how did the guy find time to take his kids to school? So we have to ask ourselves, are these human sacrifices part of genuine religious conviction, or are they part of implementing terror and political control, both within the Aztec Empire and, of course, using it against the enemies of the Aztec Empire? To be honest, we'll never know, because it's not as if we have tons of records from priests saying, I don't actually believe in any of this stuff, I just want to scare the crap out of people. Usually, by the way, the truth is a lot more complicated. Oftentimes, people understand that these sacrifices do have a practical secular benefit in solidifying political control and spreading terror, while at the same time genuinely believing in the religious and theological messages. Oh, and by the way, to end on an especially wholesome note, they also practice ritual cannibalism. So, actually, that's not the end note, because I also have to point out that war captives typically supplied Aztecs with sacrificial victims. It's sometimes speculated that Aztecs went to war, sometimes just for sacrificial victims. And let's roll that beautiful sacrificial victim footage. So here are some reliefs that we have from the Aztecs themselves. So, by the way, if you have recently eaten lunch, might want to let that digest for a bit before we talk about this. I'll give you time. Okay, time's up. If you're a winning contestant and are selected to be an Aztec sacrifice, you are taken up to a religious temple, usually the tallest building in any given Aztec city, and your midsection around your chest cavity is bisected with something like an obsidian knife, which, by the way, is kind of the equivalent of being cut open by a dull knife, because essentially it's a rock. A sharp rock, but a rock. So, while this is happening, your blood is left to pour out onto the steps. It basically runs down the entire temple. And then, to cap it all off, your still beating heart is ripped out of your chest and given to Huitzilopochtli, who, look, he's a happy boy sitting over here with his other heart, or his new heart. That's a good boy. By the way, just saying, I want to know about this guy right here who's just like literally pointing at the blood. Like, look at that. Like, thanks, Captain Obvious. So, as the Aztecs solidified around Lake Texcoco and with the founding of Tenochtitlan, Aztec society becomes pretty hierarchical. You have the ruler, who is the head of state and of the religion of the city. He is and it's almost invariably he. I don't really think there's ever a female Aztec queen or empress. The Aztec ruler is considered a representative of gods on Earth. So in other words, they're not god kings. They're not supposed to be God like the pharaohs of Egypt, but kind of in that tier right underneath them. Also kind of almost sounds like divine right of kings that we'll see in like 17th century Europe. So, as hierarchies go, this is a pretty vanilla hierarchy. It wouldn't be, like, structurally, it wouldn't seem out of place in Western Europe during feudalism. You got the ruler at the top. Then you've got this class of nobility where it's the ruler's bureaucrats and officials. You've got your priest and your military in this sort of elite noble tier. You also have, basically, everybody who is not a noble or a slave. We just kind of call them peasants. And then finally you have slaves that are basically war captives. Okay, it's a little bit more complicated than that, just like feudal Europe's social system is more complicated than that. So if you remember, the class that's kind of the spearhead of a lot of the changes in the late Middle Ages is like the middle class, and they're not really even acknowledged as being a separate class in the feudal social structure. So it's kind of similar for the Aztecs. You have this class of very wealthy professional merchants who oftentimes would have more raw wealth than the nobles themselves. So they're not really accounted for in the social hierarchy, but just because they're not explicitly accounted for and named, that doesn't mean that they're powerless. Just like merchants in feudal Europe were definitely not powerless. And not to quote the philosopher known as the Fast and the Furious series, but family was everything to the Aztecs. You have everything based on clans called capuli, and basically this dictated your overall social status. And these social distinctions were based on birth, and of course not all families were created equally. So certain families, your family background indicated whether you could own land, whether you're a laborer, whether you're providing maintenance for temples. It restricts what kind of clothing and hair you could basically wear, that kind of thing. So yeah, pretty significant. And since one of my other classes asked this, no, this is not a mustache. As far as basically the role of gender in Aztec society is concerned, what we can kind of say is that the role of women in Aztec society was probably a bit more advanced than what you would see in most places in feudal Europe. That might say more about feudal Europe than it does about the rights of women in Aztec society, however. So, on the one hand, we can say that women could own and inherit property, and they could devise it, in other words, pass it down to their heirs. They were also highly valued, as many women in militaristic societies are, as basically being what allows soldiers to basically be born and the state to continue on. So women who died in childbirth were basically conceptualized as soldiers who died victoriously in battle. And women who gave birth to famous warriors were definitely honored. So That being said, Aztec society was intensely patriarchal. So women, at least based upon their idealized version of society, would focus on household care, cooking, and weaving. And one of probably the most thankless tasks that they had is that they had to grind corn by hand on stone boards. So if you've ever had to shuck corn, you probably know how mind-numbingly dull that is. Just imagine that multiplied by 10, and you can kind of get an idea of just how gross it was. And again, let me remind you guys that this is a society that in some ways is extremely technologically advanced, but they're missing critical things like wheels. They don't have very many, they don't have iron tools really, or I don't think really much in the way of metal tools. So yeah, there are lots of things that took a long time, including construction and including the harvesting and processing of staple crops. So arranged marriages were common, and just like in feudal Europe, if you were a peasant, well, you probably got a chance to kind of marry more or less whoever you wanted. That's not because peasants were valued, but more so because nobody cared enough about peasants to dictate who they were going to marry. If you did get an arranged marriage, well, you may be trapped in a loveless existence for the rest of your life, but at least it indicated you were a somebody and you had high status. So elites, especially elite males, were very often polygamous. Commoners, your peasants, etc., they tended to be monogamous. And finally, we have to talk about the Aztec economy. Again, Egypt is the gift of the Nile, and the Aztecs are the gift of Lake Texcoco. So they have an agrarian community, but it's basically adapted to the water. Basically, it's Venice in central Mexico. They are skilled at draining swamps through irrigation and constructing terraces. And look at this. You have the Chinampas. This is where I really regret taking, German in college instead of, a language like Spanish that may have been a little bit more practical. Entschuldigung to all my German listeners. So these are man-made floating islands that they basically use to grow crops. And, the nice thing about these things, especially for the very defensive-oriented Aztecs, is that these islands were probably pretty highly defensible. So what were they growing? Maize, corn. Maize is basically corn. And beans. Once again, for the 1000th time, it wants me to remind you that you don't have the wheel or laboring animals. The Aztecs have not discovered you, Ulama. When we get to the Incas, we will talk about the all-powerful alpaca and llama. But the Aztecs were not so blessed. Merchants worked in these markets, and remember that merchants had a lot of economic power and a lot of influence, and the Aztec Empire was very much pro-trade, especially, by the way, since the Aztecs would provide security for their traders, and for the most part, everybody was a little scared to confront the Aztecs. I wonder why. So, till next time, say bye, Ulama.